It was upon the 14th of October, in that singular autumn of 1897, that the wind off the river first carried the smell of coal smoke and rain-soaked leaves into our sitting room at Baker Street, and brought with it a telegram which I shall never forget. I had been reading the morning paper aloud, more for my own ear than for Holmes's attention, when the boy in buttons came up the stair. Holmes lay along the sofa in his purple dressing gown, the long pipe between his teeth, his eyes half closed in that peculiar inward expression which I had so often mistaken, in my early days of acquaintance, for indolence. I knew now that he was thinking, and thinking with the cold rapidity of an engine under pressure. He opened the yellow envelope with one finger, glanced at it, and tossed it across the rug to me. "Read it, Watson. Aloud, if you please. Devonshire, by the postmark, and a coastal telegraph office." Note that the message was brief, and the more arresting for being so. Guest dead at Cliffside Hotel. Door locked from within, window impossible, police baffled, proprietor begs your presence, insp. Hargreaves, Exeter Constabulary. I lowered the paper and looked at my friend. "A locked room business, Holmes." "So they always say," he replied dryly. "In my experience the room is seldom locked, and seldom a room. But Hargreaves is no fool. He served under Athelney Jones in the Bishopsgate forgeries, and he has the rare merit of telegraphing only what he himself cannot explain." He swung his thin legs to the floor and reached for the Bradshaw on the mantel. "Are we going down?" "We are going down, my dear Watson, by the 11:15 from Paddington. Pack a stout coat. The Devon coast in October is a place where the wind does not so much blow as accuse. I confess that I rose with that mixture of curiosity and faint unease which always took me when Holmes set forth upon a fresh chase. As I gathered my things, he stood at the window, gazing out into the wet street, where a single hansom waited at the curb, its lamps already lit against the gathering grey. Without turning, he remarked, in that careless way of his, "I see, by the way, that your old patient from the Indian service has at last returned from the Cape, and that he travelled in some haste. Bad news of a brother, I should imagine." I stopped, half into my overcoat. "Good heavens, Holmes, Major Pendleton called only yesterday afternoon, while you were at the chemist's. I have not mentioned him to a soul." "Nor needed you." He turned, with the faintest curl at his mouth. "Your blotter, Watson, bears the impress of his note in a hand I last saw upon a prescription in your study 3 years ago. The ink is fresh, the pressure heavy, a man writing in haste, standing rather than sitting. The Cape Town postmark on the envelope you forgot to throw into the fire is rather worn at the edges, as though carried in a coat pocket on a long sea voyage. A man who has not yet found time to change his coat has not yet found time to compose himself. And he came to you, his old doctor, before he went anywhere else. Such men come for 2 things, Watson, their own health or their brother's. His own colour, judging by the firm pressure of the pen, is excellent." "Astonishing," said I, as I always said, and meaning it as I always meant it. "Trivial." He took up his ear-flapped cap. "Now to graver matter. Hargreaves does not use the word baffled lightly. There has been, somewhere in his little cliff hotel, a deed which contradicts itself. That is the only kind of crime worth our train fare. It was past 3 in the afternoon when our train at last drew into the small grey station of Lincoln Holt. A thin rain was falling, slantwise, the kind that finds the back of one's neck however one buttons one's coat, and the gulls were crying somewhere unseen above the moor. A trap was waiting. The driver, a taciturn fellow with sea-blue eyes, touched his cap and said only, "Mr. Holmes?" "The inspector's expecting you, sir. It's a bad business." We climbed in. The road wound up between high hedges, then broke suddenly upon the open cliff. Below us the sea was the colour of slate, churning at the foot of a great chalk headland. Perched upon the very edge of that headland, like a creature that had crawled out of the cliff and not quite decided whether to fall, stood the Cliffside Hotel, 3 stout stories of grey stone, with a glass conservatory thrust out over the drop, and a row of dark windows that seemed to watch our approach without welcome. From somewhere within the building, or perhaps from the cliff beneath it, There came, just once, the long, low note of a foghorn drawn out over the water like a sigh. I felt Holmes stiffen at my elbow. "That horn, Watson," he said quietly, "is on the headland 1/2 mile to the south. The wind is from the southeast. We should not be hearing it at all." He said nothing further, but as we drew up before the great oak door of the hotel, I saw that his eyes, grey and very bright, had already begun their work. Section 2. The Locked Room. The door was opened to us by a tall, gaunt man in a black coat whose long face was so pale that the rain upon his cheek might have been mistaken for tears. This, I learned, was Mr. Edgar Trant, proprietor of the Cliffside Hotel for some 11 years and a widower these last 3. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you have come," he said in a low, hurried voice. I scarcely know how to receive you. The house is in such a state, the guests confined to the drawing-room. Inspector Hargreaves above stairs." "Then we shall go above stairs," said Holmes briskly, handing his ulster to a nervous young porter who had appeared in the hall. "Watson, your professional eye will be required. Mr. Trant, lead on if you please. The fewer words upon the stair the better." We followed him up the 2 flights of dark, polished oak. The hotel had that peculiar hush which falls upon houses where something has gone irreparably wrong, not silence exactly, but a held breath. On the 2nd-floor landing, 2 constables stood at attention beside a door whose brass number 11 gleamed in the gaslight. Beside them, a stout, red-faced man in a brown overcoat was making notes in a pocketbook. He looked up, and his whole expression altered with relief. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor! I never thought to be so glad of London company. This is a queer one, gentlemen, a very queer one indeed." Inspector Hargreaves had a North Country bluntness that I liked at once. He gave us, in a few clean sentences, the essential facts. The dead man was a Mr. Cyril Vance of London, a gentleman of about 45, who had arrived at the Cliffside 3 days previously, alone, with a single leather portmanteau. He had taken room 11, the corner room overlooking the cliff. He had dined the previous evening at the common table, retired at 10, and been seen by no one since. That morning his breakfast tray had stood untouched outside his door until nearly 9. The chambermaid, alarmed by the silence and by a faint smell which she could not name, had at length summoned Mr. Trant. The door was locked. They had knocked, called, received no answer. A locksmith from the village had been fetched, and the door at last forced to disclose Mr. Vance lying upon the hearthrug, quite dead, with no mark of violence upon him save a small contusion above the right temple. "And the room, Inspector?" Holmes asked quietly. "That is the queer thing, sir. The door was bolted on the inside. The bolt, you'll see, is a heavy iron one, and was driven home. The window was latched on the inside, and outside the windows is nothing but air and the sea, 120 feet sheer. The chimney is narrow and choked with an old jackdaw's nest these 10 years past. There is no other opening. No man came in, and no man went out, and yet a man lies dead." Holmes's eyes had brightened with that hard, glittering light I had come to know. He turned to Trant. "Was Mr. Vance acquainted with any other guest in the house?" "To my knowledge, no, sir. He spoke little at dinner. He seemed preoccupied. He asked me twice whether the weather would hold." "Twice?" Holmes repeated the word softly, as one might repeat a word in a language one half remembers. "And he asked it of you, the proprietor, not of the porter, nor of the boots. Curious. Inspector, the room, if you please." Hargreaves opened the door. The chamber within was small and respectable. A narrow brass bed, a washstand, a writing desk by the window, a hearth where a fire had plainly burned itself out in the night. The deceased had been removed to a back room, but the rug upon which he had lain was still marked by the slight dark stain of his head. The window stood half open now, to clear the close air, and the wind from the sea moved the curtain in slow, irregular breaths. Holmes stood for perhaps a minute in the doorway, doing nothing, or so it would have seemed to a stranger. I knew better. His eyes travelled along the wainscot, paused at the hearth, lifted to the picture rail, descended to the carpet beside the desk. Then very suddenly he stepped in. "Watson, the bolt, examine it if you would." I crossed to the door. The bolt was, as Hargreaves had said, a heavy iron bar set in a stout iron socket, the kind of fitting one finds in old coastal houses where the wind off the sea is a tenant of long standing. I tried it. It moved with a dry, gritty resistance, and as it slid home there was a faint metallic shriek which set my teeth on edge. "It is stiff," I observed. "It does not move easily." "No," said Holmes, his back to me, eyes upon the desk. "It does not." "And yet, Watson, it was driven fully home." He turned. "Inspector, who first laid hand upon that bolt this morning?" "The locksmith, sir. He drew it back to open the door." "And before the locksmith?" "No one. The door was locked, as I said." Holmes nodded slowly. He stooped beside the writing desk and lifted, between thumb and forefinger, a single thing which he showed silently to me, a long, fair, human hair, caught in the corner of the blotter. He laid it carefully into an envelope from his pocket. I confess that, as I watched him, I felt the first cold touch of that unease which was to grow upon me with every hour of this strange business. The locked door, the impossible window, the stiff bolt that yet was shot, and now a woman's hair, where, as I supposed, no woman had ever been. Section 3. Footprints upon the cliff. Holmes did not at once mention the hair. He pocketed the envelope with the air of a man who has slipped a coin into his waistcoat against a later need, and turned again to the room. "The fire," he said. He knelt before the hearth and stirred the cold ashes with the brass poker. There was little enough left, the white, feathery residue of a coal fire well burned out, but among the powder I saw him pause once, and then a second time. Twice he lifted, on the flat of the poker, some small charred fragment, examined it against the light, and let it fall back. He did not speak. I have learned in such moments not to ask. He rose, dusted his fingers, and crossed to the writing desk. The desk was bare save for the standish, the blotter, and a brass tray for letters. The blotter bore the faint, reversed impression of writing, the last words of a hand pressed too firmly into the soft paper above. Holmes carried it to the window and held it sidelong against the grey afternoon light. "A hurried hand," he murmured. "Not the dead man's. His own letter, posted yesterday, is in the hall rack. I observed it as we came up. This writing is small, slanted, feminine, but firm. A single line, I should say. 'Inspector, the blotter is evidence. Have it brought down with us.'" He stepped next to the window and threw it wide. The wind came in with a rush, smelling of weed and salt. Below, the cliff fell sheer to a narrow strip of shingle, which the tide was already devouring. There was no ledge, no creeper, no drain-pipe, nothing whatever upon which a human being might have set foot. "Impossible, as the inspector says," I observed. "Impossible by way of the window, certainly," Holmes replied. "But observe, Watson, the sill." I came up beside him. Upon the broad stone sill, just within the casement, there was a faint, half-dried smear of something pale and gritty. "Chalk," said I. "Chalk and salt, the dust of this very cliff, and here, and here." He moved a long finger along the sill. Two distinct pressure marks, very faint, where the sash has been raised and lowered by a hand bearing chalk dust upon its glove. The marks are not in line with the natural grip of one opening the window from within. They are placed as a man would place his hands who leaned in from without. From without? But Holmes, I did not say a man came through the window, Watson. I said a man leaned in at it. There is a difference. Inspector, when the body was found, was this window latched or unlatched? "Latched, sir, firmly. The maid is positive." "Then the leaning in was done earlier, before, not after, the death. Interesting." He thrust his head and shoulders out into the wind and remained so for nearly a minute motionless. When he drew back, his face was very keen. "Watson, your hat. We are going out upon the cliff." We descended by a side door, and Mr. Trant, after a moment's hesitation, accompanied us. The path which led around the seaward face of the hotel was narrow, edged on the one side by the rough stone of the building, and on the other by a low iron rail beyond which there was nothing but the long, sickening drop. Halfway along, beneath the corner where room 11 projected above us, Holmes halted. The turf here was thin and worn by weather. Worn. Pressed into it quite clearly were two long, narrow marks, the prints, not of feet, but of the feet of a ladder. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, sunk a little into the soft ground, and beside the right-hand one, a small heel mark, very fresh, where a man's boot had braced. "A ladder," I exclaimed. "Set up against the wall last night?" "In the small hours, I should say. The dew has formed since, but unevenly here in the shelter of the wall. A long ladder, Watson, long enough to reach a second-story window, and brought, mark this, along that cliff path, which a man might traverse only by moonlight and at very great peril. Holmes turned to the proprietor. "Mr. Trant, who in this household possesses a ladder of such length?" The poor man looked utterly bewildered. "Why, there is the old painter's ladder in the stable-yard, sir, but it has not been moved these 6 months. The gardener, Moores, would know." "Have Moores summoned." "Quietly." "To the conservatory, if you please." Trant withdrew. Holmes stooped and with the silver knife he carries, lifted from the turf a single thread, a coarse, dark fibre, perhaps an inch long. He laid it upon his palm and showed it to me. "Tarred rope, Watson, from the lashing of a ladder. Now look and listen." I listened. The wind, the gulls, the sea breaking upon the rocks below, and then, drawn long and low across the water, that same note I had heard upon our arrival. The foghorn from the southern headland, sounding in a wind which should not have carried it. Holmes's grey eyes met mine. "It sounds again, you observe, although the wind has shifted no farther in our favour. It will be worth our while, before this case is done, to discover why." I felt, although I could not have said why, that some pattern was forming about us in the salt air, a pattern which I sensed without seeing, as a man senses a hand passed close to his face in the dark. Section 4. The young man in the conservatory. The gardener Moores proved to be a slow, weather-beaten man of 60, with hands like knots of oak and a habit of looking, when addressed, at the speaker's boots rather than his face. He admitted, after some prodding, that the long painter's ladder had been kept in the stable-yard, lashed against the wall under a tarpaulin. He had last seen it there on Tuesday evening. This morning, when Inspector Hargreaves's constable had asked him, he had found it lying flat in the same place, but the tarpaulin folded otherwise than he had folded it, and the lashing rope cut clean through. "Cut, Moores?" Holmes asked. "Cut, sir, with a sharp knife, not frayed nor unpicked, a clean cut." "You are sure no one in the household borrowed it?" "I'm sure, sir, they'd have asked me. They always do." Holmes thanked him and dismissed him. Then, with that economy of motion which was so characteristic of him, he led Hargreaves and myself through the chill conservatory, a long glass gallery thrust out over the cliff, and into the drawing-room where the assembled guests waited. There were 5 of them, ranged about the room with that air of self-conscious composure which civilized people assume in the presence of disaster. By the fire stood a thick-set, florid gentleman of perhaps 50, Mr. Josiah Crail, a wine merchant from Bristol, as I afterward learned, who had come down for the sea air. Near him, upon the sofa, sat a slender woman in black, her veil thrown back, who proved to be a Mrs. Hester Lockwood, a widow travelling alone. By the window, a thin, dark-haired clergyman in a clerical collar, the Reverend Mr. Alban Fry, read or affected to read from a small Greek Testament. In a corner armchair, half hidden by the curtain, sat a pale young woman of perhaps 24, with hair so fair as to be almost silver, Miss Eleanor Carstairs, the niece of the proprietor, who, I gathered, made her home at the hotel. And by the conservatory door, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of a brown Norfolk jacket, paced a young man of about 30, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with the restless eye of one not accustomed to enforced idleness. This was a Mr. Daniel Pellow, lately returned, as he himself volunteered before he was asked, from a surveying engagement in South America. It was upon Mr. Pellow that Inspector Hargreaves's eye now rested with a quiet but unmistakable steadiness. "Mr. Pellow," said he, "I am compelled, sir, to put certain questions to you, of which I have already given Mr. Holmes the substance. You will oblige me by answering them in his hearing." Pellow's brown face flushed a little, but he nodded shortly. "Ask what you will, Inspector." "You arrived at this hotel the day before Mr. Vance, I think?" "I did." "You and he had previous acquaintance?" "We had. We were at school together, 20 years gone. We had not met since. Yet you dined apart, and were observed by the porter to exchange sharp words in the corridor on Wednesday evening." Pellow set his jaw. "We did exchange words, I will not deny it. Vance had wronged a person dear to me some years ago in a matter of money. I told him so. He laughed. There was no more between us than that." "And last night, sir, the night of his death, where were you between the hours of midnight and 4? "In my bed, asleep." "Yet your boots, sir, when the boots boy took them this morning, were caked with wet chalk. Your room overlooks the inland yard, not the sea. How came chalk upon your boots?" Pello opened his mouth, closed it, and at length said with a kind of bitter quiet, "I walked upon the cliff last night, before I retired. I could not sleep, that is all." A small silence followed. I confess my own thought leapt at once to the laddered marks, the chalk smear upon the sill, the dead man and the angry quarrel, and I saw from the satisfied set of Hargreaves's chin that he had leapt thither already. The case against Mr. Pello seemed, in that instant, almost overwhelming. I glanced at Holmes. He stood by the window, his thin fingers tapping idly upon the glass, his eyes upon Pello's face with an expression neither of acceptance nor of doubt, but of something else, a kind of patient hunger. "Mr. Pello," he said at last, very gently, "when you walked upon the cliff last night, did you, by chance, hear the foghorn?" The young man stared at him. "The foghorn? Why, yes, twice, I think. It struck me as odd. The night was clear." "Quite so. And one further question. Were you alone upon that path?" Pello hesitated. His eyes flickered, in spite of himself, to the corner where Miss Carstairs sat. It was the briefest glance, a thing of half a second, but Holmes caught it, as he caught all such things, and his eyelids drooped a little, as they did when he was most awake. "I was alone," said Pello, steadily enough. "Thank you," said Holmes. "That will do for the moment." When we had withdrawn into the hall, Hargreaves turned to my friend with the eagerness of a man whose case has built itself in his hand. "Well, sir, a quarrel, the cliff path, the chalk, the ladder in the yard within his reach. What more do we want?" Holmes did not answer at once. He stood looking back at the closed drawing-room door. "What more, Inspector? Only this, that the case is too good. It fits every joint of it, as a well-made coffin fits its corpse. And in my experience, Hargreaves, when a thing fits as well as that, some hand has been at work upon the timbers. Section 5. A hair, a glove, and a silence. Hargreaves, I could see, was not pleased. He was a good officer and a humble one, but he had a North Country man's preference for the obvious, and there is no policeman alive who loves to hear his case called too good. He went off presently to telegraph to Exeter for a constable to keep a quiet watch upon Mr. Pello's door, and Holmes and I were left, for the first time since our arrival, to ourselves. We took refuge in the conservatory, where the dying afternoon laid long bars of greenish light across the tiled floor, and the sea below us was beginning to whiten under the freshening wind. Holmes lit a cigarette, and for some minutes he said nothing whatever, but stood with one elbow on a wicker chair and his eyes upon the sky. "Holmes," I said at last, unable to bear it, "the case against the young man is very strong." "It is admirable," he said. "It is, in fact, a small work of art. Whoever constructed it possesses, Watson, a tidy mind, a steady nerve, and a most regrettable familiarity with the methods of Scotland Yard. Did you remark how every clue lay so conveniently to hand? The boots, the chalk, the ladder, the old quarrel, all in a row like soldiers presenting arms? Then you do not believe Pello killed Vance? I do not yet say. I say only that I should be very sorry to see him hanged upon evidence so accommodating." He turned. "Watson, I must trespass upon your discretion. There are two matters concerning which I require your absolute silence, even from Hargreaves, until I give you leave. You have it." He drew from his pocket the small envelope into which he had placed the fair human hair, and beside it a second envelope which I had not seen him fill. First the hair. It was caught, as you saw, in the corner of the blotter on Vance's writing desk. It is not Vance's, his is grey and short. It is not Pello's, his is dark and rough. It is not Moore's, nor Trant's, nor the Reverend Mr. Fry's. It is fair, fine, and unusually long. There is in this hotel exactly one head of such hair. "Miss Carstairs," said I slowly. "Miss Eleanor Carstairs," said Holmes, "who is the niece of the proprietor whose home is in this house, and at whose unguarded glance Mr. Pello betrayed himself in the drawing-room not half an hour since. The hair was caught not loose upon the floor, but in the blotter, as if a head had bent low over the desk, perhaps to read what was written there. Now, what was written there, Watson?" He held up the second envelope. From it he withdrew a thin folded sheet and unfolded it with care. It was the blotting paper from the desk. He laid it upon the wicker table and lit a second match. The hurried, slanting hand which had been pressed into the paper showed, in its mirror image, 3 or 4 words only. We bent over it together. I read them with a quickening pulse. "Do not come, for God's sake." "A warning," I whispered. "A warning written to someone, by someone, within the hour of the murder." "Written, I should say, by Miss Carstairs," said Holmes quietly, "and not posted. The letter itself was burned, Watson. That was the second of the charred fragments in the grate, a corner of cream-laid paper of the same fibre as the blotter's print. The hand that wrote the warning was the hand that burned it, but not, I think, the hand that struck the blow." "Then she is innocent?" "She is afraid," said Holmes. "There is a great difference. Innocence does not write at midnight in a stranger's room, nor burn its own letters, nor leave its hair upon a dead man's blotter. But neither does murder commonly write, 'for God's sake,' before committing itself." He folded the blotter away. "Watson, I conceal this from Hargreaves not from any want of trust in him, but because I will not have it acted upon prematurely. If she is the bait of a snare, the snare must spring upon the trapper, not the bait." He had scarcely finished when there came a soft sound at the conservatory door. We turned. Miss Carstairs herself stood upon the threshold, very pale, her hand resting lightly upon the lintel. She wore a grey shawl about her thin shoulders, and her fair hair, in the long light, seemed almost without colour. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice, "I beg your pardon. I had hoped to speak with you alone." "Miss Carstairs, Dr. Watson is myself in all that concerns this case. Pray come in." She entered, but did not sit. Her grey eyes, I remember them well, moved from Holmes's face to mine and back again. And she pressed her hands together as if to still some inner trembling. From the pocket of her gown she drew, after a moment's hesitation, a single object, and laid it upon the wicker table between us. It was a glove. A lady's glove, of dove-grey kid, the right hand only, summered along the back of the wrist with a faint, unmistakable rust-coloured stain. "I found this," she whispered, "this morning in the conservatory, when no one was looking. It was not mine. I do not know whose it is, but I dared not show it to the inspector. Mr. Holmes, I am very frightened." Holmes took the glove without a word. His eyes, however, did not leave her face, and in them I saw, for the first time in this strange business, that peculiar stillness which in my friend was always the herald of a dangerous certainty. "Miss Carstairs," he said softly, "you have done very wisely. I beg you to go on being frightened, but only of the right person. Section 6. The Second Death." She did not stay long after that. Holmes pressed her gently for the hour at which she had found the glove, the precise spot, beneath a fern by the conservatory's seaward window, and the names of any who had been about that corner of the house at the time. To each question she returned a low, hurried answer, her eyes upon the floor, and at length, refusing the chair he offered her, she begged us to keep her confidence and withdrew, the grey shawl drawn close about her like a creature seeking burrow. When the door had closed behind her, Holmes laid the dove-grey glove flat upon the table and bent above it with his lens. He did not speak. I watched him in silence. The stain upon the kid was, as I had supposed, blood, but very little of it, a smear rather than a soaking, and the leather was new, scarcely creased at the knuckles, as if it had been worn but seldom. "A small hand," I observed. "A woman's. A woman's glove, Watson, which is not, mark you, quite the same thing. Note the spread across the palm. This glove has been worn upon a hand to which it was a thought too large. Note also the slight outward stretching at the seam of the thumb. This glove has been forced on and quickly, by a hand, I should say, accustomed to working gloves rather than gloves of dress. By a left hand, moreover, thrust into a right-hand glove in haste. The seam is wrenched the wrong way. A man, then? A man, Watson, who wished to leave a woman's glove." I confess that I sat back rather sharply. "Then the snare is for her." "The snare," said Holmes, folding the glove into his pocket-book, "is for whoever shall first stoop to pick it up. It has already caught one head, Pellows, by the chalk on his boots. Now it casts for a second. I do not propose, Watson, to be the third." He rose and went to the window. The sky had darkened with a swiftness peculiar to that coast. Great ragged battalions of cloud were marching in from the southeast, and the sea below had taken on that leaden, hammered look which precedes the worst of weather. As I watched him standing there, lean and motionless against the failing light, I felt my own unease deepen into something nearer to dread. The hotel, with its hushed corridors and its locked door above, seemed to me suddenly a thing alive, listening, calculating, waiting. We dined in the small private parlour which Mr. Trant had set aside for us. Holmes ate almost nothing, he spoke even less. Twice during the meal he rose and went to the window, and once he stepped softly out into the passage, returning after some minutes with no remark. By 9 o'clock the wind had risen to a wail, and the rain was driving in long grey ropes against the panes. It was at 10:15 that we heard the scream. It came from the upper floor, a single high, terrible criour, broken off as if a hand had been clapped over the mouth that uttered it. I was on my feet in an instant, Holmes at my heels. The corridor above was already in confusion. Doors flung open, a candle held aloft by Mr. Trant, whose hand shook so that the wax fell upon the carpet, the Reverend Mr. Fry in his dressing gown, the wine merchant Crail in his shirt sleeves, the widow Mrs. Lockwood, half fainting against the wall. "It came from the back stair," cried Trant. "The servants' stair," but Holmes was past him before he had done speaking. We plunged down a narrow flight which gave upon a passage at the rear of the building. There, at the foot of the stair, beneath a single sputtering gas jet, lay the gardener Moores, face downward upon the boards, his arms flung out as if he had pitched forward in mid-stride. A dark, slow stain was spreading upon the planks beneath his grey head. Holmes knelt instantly. I, after the manner of my profession, knelt beside him. The old man still breathed barely, but the wound at the back of his skull, struck by some heavy and rounded thing, was such as I knew, with the cold knowledge of long army service, no surgery of mine could mend. He looked up at me, his sea-blue eyes already filming, and his lips moved. The light," whispered. "Saw the light on the path." His head fell back. He was dead before the parlour clock below struck the half-hour. Holmes rose. He was very pale, and his grey eyes had narrowed to two bright, hard lines. "Watson," he said quietly, "this changes everything. We had a murderer in this house. We have him still, so, and he is now hurried, and a hurried murderer is a dangerous one. Inspector," for Hargreaves had come up panting behind us, "no one leaves this corridor, no one. The doors of every guest are to be sealed by a constable until I give the word." "But Mr. Holmes, Pello's door, Inspector, has been sealed by your man these past 2 hours. Mr. Pello did not strike this blow." Hargreaves stared at him. "Then who, sir, in God's name?" Holmes did not answer at once. He stepped past the body and laid his finger upon the lowest baluster of the servants' stair. From it, scarcely visible in the gaslight, he lifted a single grain of pale, gritty dust. He held it upon his nail and turned it slowly. Then, without a word to Hargreaves, he turned to me, and I saw upon his face an expression I had seen perhaps thrice before in all our acquaintance, the look of a man who has, in one stroke, seen a great pattern entire. "Watson," he said very low, "I have been a fool. The light upon the path, the horn that should not sound. Come, there is no time. We have perhaps 3 hours." He plunged down the back stair into the storm. Section 7. The Lantern on the Cliff. The wind out of doors took the breath from my lungs the instant we stepped beyond the porch. Holmes had paused only to snatch up his ulster and a dark lantern from the hall stand, and to whisper 3 words into Hargreaves's ear. What they were I did not hear, but the inspector's face set hard, and he nodded once. "Watson, your revolver?" "In my pocket." "Good. Keep it there until I say. Now, silently, if you please, hug the cliffside of the house and walk in my step." He led me not down the carriage drive, but along that same narrow path beneath the room 11 by which we had earlier found the marks of the ladder. The rain struck us slantwise. The lantern, shuttered, gave only a thin slit of light at our feet. The sea below was a roaring darkness. Once, far out, I caught the rhythmic flash of a vessel's lamp, and once, very faintly, the long, low note of the foghorn from the southern headland, though there was no fog whatever, only the rain. Holmes halted suddenly and laid a hand upon my arm. "Listen." I listened. Above the wind I heard, or thought I heard, the small dry scrape of a boot upon stone, somewhere ahead and below us, where the cliff path narrowed into a goat track descending toward the shore. "He has gone down to the beach," Holmes breathed. "Of course he has. He must. Watson, the affair is older than this house. We are not at the end of it. We are at the middle. Come." He thrust the dark lantern into my hand. "When I say now, uncover it. Not before. Not though you should hear me cry out, do you understand? I understand. We descended. The goat track was slippery as glass, and I have no notion how I kept my footing, but Holmes went down before me with the silent rapidity of a cat. At a turn of the path, behind a great shoulder of chalk, he drew me back into the shadow and pointed. Below us, perhaps 30 feet, a narrow shelf of rock projected over the sea. Upon that shelf, hooded and dark, a figure was crouching. In his hands was a lantern, not a common lantern, but one of those small box lanterns with a sliding shutter which sailors use for signalling. As we watched, he raised it, and 3 times, slowly, he opened and shut the slide toward the open sea. Far out in the blackness, 3 answering flashes pricked the dark. A signal, I whispered. A signal which has been answered every night, Watson, this week past. The foghorn from the southern headland is not a foghorn, or rather, it is one, but it is being sounded by a confederate at irregular hours, as cover. Twice we have heard it when no fog warranted it. Twice this man has signalled. And once, last night, a boat came in beneath this very shelf and a man was brought ashore. Brought ashore? Or taken off, we shall see. Holmes set his lips. Now, Watson, the lantern. When the man below has answered the next flash from the sea, and he will, in perhaps a minute, uncover ours full upon him, and at the same instant cry his name as loudly as you can. The name, Watson, is Fry. I started. The clergyman! The clergyman who has read his Greek Testament these 3 evenings with the book held upside down? Watson! A thing I observed in the drawing-room and did not at the time think worth a remark. The clergyman whose collar was a ½ inch too large for his neck, and whose hand, when he turned the page, bore upon its knuckle a small white scar of the shape and place of a sailor's fid mark. The clergyman who alone of all this household had no business whatever upon the back stair tonight. Quiet now. We crouched, breathing the wet salt air. Out at sea 3 flashes again. The hooded figure raised his shutter. As his answering flash kindled, I threw open the slide of my own lantern. A great clear shaft of yellow leapt out and struck him full in the face. "Fry!" I shouted, with all the strength of my lungs. The man started as though shot. His hood fell back, and beneath it I saw, not the lean, sallow face of the Reverend Mr. Alban Fry, but a square, brown, wind-bitten countenance, with a livid scar from temple to jaw, and eyes that, even at that distance, glittered with the cold ferocity of a hunted animal. He snatched at his coat, and I saw the steel of a pistol. "Down, Watson!" cried Holmes. The shot rang out, and a fragment of chalk burst from the rock 6 inches above my head. Then, before I could fire in answer, the man had turned, leapt for the path beyond the shelf, and was scrambling up the cliff to seaward of us, lantern abandoned, with the agility of a goat. "After him! No! Watson, not that way!" Holmes caught my arm. "He will go for the hotel, he must. There is something there he has not yet got. Hargreaves is upon the carriage drive with 2 men. We take the cliff path. Now run." We ran. How we kept the path I cannot tell. Twice I slipped. Twice Holmes's iron hand was upon my collar. The wind tore at us, the rain blinded us, and through it all, ahead and above, I heard the scrabbling of the fugitive among the loose stones. We burst at last upon the lawn before the conservatory. The glass gallery blazed with light, and every lamp within it kindled. Through the streaming panes I saw, with a shock that stopped my heart, the slim figure of Miss Carstairs, alone, her grey shawl about her, standing as if frozen. And, advancing upon her from the inner door, the man we had hunted, his pistol raised, his scarred face contorted with a fury too great for words. Section 8. The pattern made plain. Holmes did not check his stride. He flung open the conservatory door so violently that 2 of the panes cracked across, and his voice rang out above the wind with a clarity that I think I shall hear in my dreams to the end of my days. "Captain Rennie, drop your weapon. The path behind you is taken. There is a constable at the seaward door. You have lost." The man whirled. For an instant, 1 instant only, I thought he would fire. The muzzle wavered toward Holmes, then toward Miss Carstairs, then back to Holmes again. And in that instant the door at the far end of the conservatory burst open, and Inspector Hargreaves, with 2 stout Devon constables, stepped through, their bull's-eyes flashing upon the wet glass. The pistol fell from the scarred man's hand and clattered upon the tiles. He did not resist as the constables took him. He stood quite still, his eyes upon Miss Carstairs' face, and upon his own there came an expression which I will not attempt to describe, a look in which hate and exhaustion and a strange bitter regret were all confounded. "You should not have come here, Eleanor," he said hoarsely. "I told you in the letter. I told you not to come." The girl had sunk into a wicker chair. She did not weep. She raised her grey eyes to his face and said in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "You wrote it then, the warning." "I wrote it to Vance, to keep him from speaking. It was you who took the letter from his desk and burned it. I saw you do it from the cliff, through his window, when he was already dead at my feet." The man laughed, with a short, mirthless sound. "You meant to shield me. You did not even know what you shielded." "That," said Holmes quietly, "will be enough. Inspector, your charge will not be the murder of Cyril Vance alone, but of Edwin Moores, late gardener of this house, and beyond those of a matter older and graver, of which the Admiralty will have something to say. Captain Rennie is the gentleman, you will recall, whose name appeared in the Plymouth Dockyard inquiry of '94, and whose subsequent disappearance was so much regretted by my brother Mycroft." Hargreaves's eyes were like saucers, but he was too good an officer to ask questions before the prisoner. The constables led the man away, the conservatory door was closed, and we were left with Miss Carstairs, who was now weeping quietly, the strain of 3 days at last broken. Holmes drew up a chair beside her. He did not touch her. He spoke very gently. "Miss Carstairs, you have borne much. I will trouble you for one answer only. Captain Rennie is your half-brother, is he not?" She nodded, without lifting her head. "By my mother's first marriage. He came to England in secret a fortnight ago. He wrote to me. I did not know what he had done, only that he was hunted, and that he was my brother. He bade me say nothing. Mr. Vance had been an officer of the customs at Plymouth. He had known Edward, had known my brother long ago. He came to this hotel because he had at last traced him here. And on the night of his death you went to Mr. Vance's room, to beg him not to denounce Edward. I scarcely know what I said. He was kind. He told me he must do his duty, but that he would give my brother till morning. He bade me leave the letter, a letter Edward had written him, threatening him, upon his desk, and he would consider it. I did not know that Edward was already upon the cliff with a ladder, watching at the window. I did not know, God help me, that when I went away my brother would come in by that window and—" She could not go on. Holmes nodded once, slowly. "You wrote your warning to your brother then in haste in your own room, and pressed it upon the blotter, the same blotter you replaced upon Mr. Vance's desk when you returned, before dawn, to take away your brother's letter from the grate. You took the letter, you burned it, and a single hair betrayed you. You hid the dove-grey glove in the conservatory, not, as I at first supposed, by the murderer's design, but by your brother's, to incriminate Mr. Pellow, whom your brother had marked, from your own innocent confidences to him in his letters, as a former enemy of Vance. The plan was crude. It was almost successful." Miss Carstairs lifted her face. "And old Moores?" "Moores," said Holmes, "saw a light upon the cliff path last night. He said as much to me this very afternoon, in a glance which I, fool that I was, did not at the time pursue. Your brother knew that Moores had seen, and that Moores was the only man in this house with the country wisdom to put a ladder, a cliff path, and a signal light into a single sentence. He struck him down upon the servants' stair when he came in tonight to fetch the second lantern from the still room." There was a long silence. The wind had fallen a little, the rain still hissed upon the glass. "And the smuggling, Holmes?" I asked, for I confess I had been slow to grasp it. "The signals to the sea?" "Not smuggling, Watson, or not chiefly. Captain Rennie was, until '94, an officer of His Majesty's Navy. He sold in that year certain papers to a foreign power. He was suspected, fled, and was thought drowned. He has been these 3 years in the employ of that power upon our southern coast, signalling out by night to a vessel which lies beyond the headland, not contraband goods, Watson, but information. Vance, who had once served against him, recognised him in this house, and would have written to the Admiralty by the morning post. That post never went. Captain Rennie saw to it." The girl had begun to weep again. Holmes rose. His grey eyes, when they met mine, held no triumph, only that quiet, tired clarity which always followed his greatest successes. "It is a sad business, Watson," he said, "but it is a finished one. Section 9. The Reckoning in Room 11. There remained, however, one act yet to play, for though Captain Rennie was in irons in the village lock-up before midnight, Holmes would not consider the matter closed until he had gathered, at his own request, every soul of the household in the very room where Mr. Vance had met his death. Inspector Hargreaves protested mildly. It was, he said, an unseemly hour and an unseemly place. But Holmes had that quiet inflexibility which I had long since learned was useless to oppose, and at 1 in the morning we were assembled, 8 of us in all, in room 11. The fire had been lit again. Its red light fell upon the worn carpet where the dead man had lain, upon the brass bed, upon the writing desk whence the blotter had been taken, upon the faces of the guests, Mr. Crail heavy and unsmiling, Mrs. Lockwood drawn and grey, Mr. Pellow standing very straight beside Miss Carstairs' chair, the Reverend Mr. Fry, who, as I now understood, was a genuine clergyman after all, and had merely the misfortune of a borrowed name and an ill-fitting collar, seated quietly in the corner. Mr. Trant, the proprietor, hovered miserably by the door. Holmes stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, the storm at last quieting beyond the glass. "I have asked you here," he began in his clear, dry voice, "not from any taste for ceremony, but because 3 persons in this room have laboured under a false suspicion these past hours, and they have a right to hear the truth in the place where it was sown. I shall be brief. The case has had 3 falsities and 1 truth. Permit me to set them in their order. The first falsity was the locked room. Mr. Vance's door was bolted from within, his window latched from within, and yet a man had been there who was not Vance. The contradiction was real, but its solution was simple. The bolt upon that door is stiff as the doctor. Watson observed. It shrieks as it slides. When Miss Carstairs left the room before midnight, she pressed it to but not home, a small kindness to herself that she might re-enter unheard. Captain Rennie, mounting his ladder from the cliff path, found the bolt thus, and Mr. Vance, still living, opening the window in surprise at the sound. The blow was struck within. The captain then went out as he had come, by the ladder, latching the window behind him with a knife blade through the gap, a trick known to any seaman. When Miss Carstairs returned before dawn to remove her brother's threatening letter from the grate, she pressed the stiff bolt fully home in her panic at finding the man dead, believing, as her brother had bidden her believe, that the body must be discovered only in the morning and only by another hand. Thus the room locked itself by 2 innocent fears after the murderer had gone. The second falsity was Mr. Pellow. The chalk upon his boots was the honest chalk. He had walked upon the cliff, as he said, and for a reason of his own. Here Holmes's grey eyes rested for the briefest instant upon Miss Carstairs, who lowered hers, which is none of our concern. The ladder marks, the borrowed quarrel, the cut lashing in the yard, these were laid for him by a hand which knew his history, and which knew that a young man with a grievance is the readiest goat in any flock. Mr. Pellow, you have my apology for the discomfort of an hour. Pellow bowed very stiffly, his face working. The third falsity was the glove. A woman's glove, smeared with blood, laid in the conservatory by a man, a left hand thrust into a right-hand glove, a seam wrenched, the kid scarcely creased at the knuckles. It was meant to draw the eye toward Miss Carstairs herself should Mr. Pellow's frame prove too flimsy. It very nearly drew mine. I confess it. The truth, the single truth that ran beneath all 3, was this, that there was in this house a hidden traffic between the land and the sea, a foghorn that sounded without fog, a lantern that answered a signal from a vessel beyond the headland, a guest who read his Greek with the page reversed. That, Mr. Fry, was not you, sir. Pardon me, your collar was merely too large, and your name had been borrowed by another, in correspondence I had read this summer in my brother's office. The traffic was treason, gentlemen, and Mr. Cyril Vance, who had recognised the trafficker, was killed for the sake of a letter he had not yet written. Old Moores, who had seen a light upon the cliff, was killed for the sake of a sentence he had not yet spoken. That is the whole of it. The architecture was elegant, the cruelty methodical. But every architecture, ladies and gentlemen, betrays its architect, and this one betrayed Captain Edward Rennie by 1 grain of chalk upon a baluster, 1 hair upon a blotter, and 1 note of a horn, carried upon the wrong wind. He ceased. The fire crackled. Mr. Crail let out a long, slow breath. Mrs. Lockwood crossed herself. Mr. Trant put his hand to his eyes. Miss Carstairs sat very still. After a moment she rose, walked, with the steadiness of a sleepwalker, to where Holmes stood, and laid her thin hand for a moment upon his sleeve. "You have been merciful, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "in what you have not said as well as in what you have." Holmes inclined his head. "Madam, the law will require some of what I have not said, but it will not require all. Mr. Pellow, I think, will not require any." Pellow had come up beside her. He did not speak. He merely took her other hand and held it. And at that quiet gesture, more than at any oratory, I felt the long strain of the night break and run from my shoulders like water. Section 10. The Wind Off the Sea. We did not leave the Cliffside Hotel until the afternoon of the following day. There were depositions to be made, telegrams to be dispatched, a brother of Holmes's in Whitehall to be informed by a wire of 3 words, "Rennie taken alive," to which the reply, when it came back, was of 2, "Well done." It was, I think, the only acknowledgment Holmes ever received from Mycroft for that service. He was, however, quite content with it. Captain Rennie was conveyed to Exeter under heavy guard. He made no confession, but he made no resistance either. He sat in the trap with his eyes upon the grey sea, and once, as they led him from the porch, he glanced up at the windows of the conservatory and then looked away. Miss Carstairs did not come down. She had been put to bed by the housekeeper, in a state more of exhaustion than of grief, and the local doctor, an excellent man with whom I conferred upon his arrival, gave me his word that she would do well. The matter of her own part in the affair, the burning of her brother's letter, the concealment of the glove, was, by Holmes's quiet management with Hargreaves and with certain authorities higher than Hargreaves, kept from the public prints. Whether she was wholly innocent in the eye of strict justice I will not say, but I have seen in long practice that there is a kind of guilt which is itself a punishment, and she had that kind. Mr. Pellow remained at the hotel a further 3 days. He left on the Monday morning with Miss Carstairs upon his arm and her small leather trunk upon the trap. They were married very quietly at a Devon parish church in the spring of the following year. I have not seen them since, but a Christmas card from Bristol year after year in a small slanted hand reaches Baker Street even now, and Holmes, although he affects to despise such sentimental observances, has been known to set it upon the mantelpiece behind the Persian slipper, where it remains until Twelfth Night. The Reverend Mr. Alban Fry, who had been an innocent and rather bewildered spectator throughout, took his Greek Testament to Bath, where, I'm told, he still preaches upon Sundays. Mr. Crail returned to his Bristol wine trade, considerably the soberer for his Devon holiday. Mrs. Lockwood, the quiet widow, took rooms at Torquay, and old Moores was buried in the churchyard at Lincoln, with a stone paid for by Holmes's discreet arrangement, out of the captain's confiscated effects. It was, I felt, a small but proper justice. We caught the 4 o'clock train from Lincoln Halt. The rain had ceased. A clean, hard, blue afternoon had succeeded it, and the gulls cried above the cliffs as if nothing whatever had happened beneath. Holmes was in that quiet, almost melancholy humour which sometimes followed his greatest exertions. He sat with his pipe unlit in his teeth, his long legs crossed, his eyes upon the moving fields. "It was a near thing, Watson," he said at length. "Near, Holmes. Very near. Had I trusted 12 hours longer the case which Hargreaves so reasonably built against Mr. Pellow, that young man would now be in Exeter jail, and a traitor would be in a boat off Ushant. We were saved by a single grain of chalk and an old gardener's failing eye. I do not love such margins. You forget the hair upon the blotter. I forget nothing, Watson, but the hair told me only that a woman had been there. It did not tell me which woman, nor why. The grain of chalk upon the lowest baluster of the servants' stair, that told me that the man who struck Moores had come up from the cliff path, and could therefore not be the man whose door was, at that moment, sealed by a Devon constable. Without that grain, I should still have been wrong. He smiled faintly. It is a humbling business, my dear fellow, to depend for one's livelihood upon dust. And the foghorn? The foghorn was the first stone in the whole arch. The wind was southeast, the horn was southwest. Sound, Watson, does not travel against the wind unless it is helped. Some confederate of the captain's, posted at the lighthouse, was sounding it at irregular hours as cover for his signals, a thing too clever by half, for it was the cleverness of it that betrayed him. The simplest crimes, Watson, are committed in silence. It is the artful ones which sing. He fell quiet again. The train ran on through the lengthening shadows. Presently, as we crossed a low bridge above an estuary, the western light caught the river, and Holmes turned to me with that rare, slight smile, which warmed his grave face as nothing else could. "You will write this one up, I suppose?" "If you permit, Holmes. Permit by all means, only be merciful, as the young lady said. Leave out, if you will, the matter of her hand upon the blotter, and put in, if you must put in anything, that the brother died for the sister, as well as the sister suffered for the brother. It is not quite true, but it is no further from the truth than any verdict the assize court will deliver upon him. I gave him my word, and I have, in the foregoing pages, kept it after my own fashion." The lamps were lit upon the platform at Paddington when we drew in, and a thin London fog, very different from the great clean wind off the Devon Sea, was creeping yellow through the iron arches. Holmes drew on his gloves, picked up his stick, and stepped down. At the cab stand he paused and looked back at me with the faintest gleam in his grey eyes. "Order, Watson," he said, "is the supreme luxury of the civilised. We rented it tonight, at Cliffside, for a fee of 2 lives and 1 small grain of chalk. It is, on the whole, a bargain, but I should not care to make it twice in 1 week." He whistled for a hansom, and we drove home through the fog to Baker Street.